Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video I'm going to talk about Liz Truss's recent trip to see the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, if I pronounce that correctly, and it was, as to be expected, a tense and unproductive affair. But I wanted to talk a few things about this because there were some interesting reports that came out of it. And I will caution that with these things, you should always be extremely cautious about believing everything you read or hear, particularly from the media, because there is a lot of spin, there's a lot of propaganda, politics and so on going on here. But I think there's a few interesting bits that we can look into, particularly from a negotiation perspective. So first I'm going to focus a little bit on the title of this video, which is that apparently Liz Truss annoyed the Russian foreign minister. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes the Russians do deserve to be annoyed, and we can only speculate as to why and how she annoyed him. There's a couple of options here. One is she was practicing diplomacy, and the Russians didn't like that, and I will talk more about that. And the other possible option is that Liz Truss went and got strident, a bit high-pitched. She'd known to do that, but I think in recent months, we've seen her attempt to tone that down. So I think we shall assume, for the purpose of this video, that Liz Truss didn't lose her rag. She didn't get strident. She just did what she was meant to be, which was, the UK's political diplomat, essentially, to Russia, to try and seek a resolution on the Ukraine issue. So let's talk a little bit about that. First thing, I'm just going to put there one of my favourite quotes about diplomacy, which is that it is the art of telling someone to go to hell in such a way that they look forward to the trip. Now, diplomacy and negotiation have quite a lot in common. However, there's some very specific things about diplomacy that are not inherently what you would get in a negotiation. So, for example, diplomacy is, because of the stakes involved, everyone is extremely cautious about what they say during a diplomatic setting. This means the pace is very slow. This means that the words are very carefully chosen, choreographed before the people ever even meet, and there's very little movement as a rule. And this is because even the slightest deviation can be taken as movement by the other side, taken as compromise maybe, when in fact you hadn't intended to compromise. So what a lot of diplomacy tends to be, in some ways, is people just repeating things to each other over and over again, perhaps with a few different well-chosen words here and there, but that's what it is, and that is the nature of diplomacy, which is a bit different from an actual negotiation, because with the negotiation you're usually seeking to achieve some sort of outcome. With diplomacy, that outcome may not necessarily be the same thing as what you would get in a negotiation. What I mean by that, there's actually two different types of diplomacy. There's quiet diplomacy and loud diplomacy. Quiet diplomacy is what you don't see. You don't hear about it. It happens behind closed doors, and that is where pretty much all business, all progress is made at government level. And this is closer to a proper negotiation, where the protagonists sit in the room, they exchange notes, they compare their positions, they seek to find ways through. Loud diplomacy, in contrast, is all about politics. So you're there to play a game, make a bit of a show of it, and then after having played the game, you then go out in a press conference and make lots of loud noises, and again, a show of diplomacy. And quite often that sort of diplomacy is to show that you did try and do something, perhaps if for a domestic political reason, perhaps for international political reason, perhaps even just to send a signal to the other side. But that sort of diplomacy does not necessarily go out there for the purpose of seeking resolution to the problem. So I would say that Liz Truss went to Russia to meet Sergei Lavrov, fully knowing that she wouldn't make much progress. And to be honest, she's far from alone. Just about every single world leader seems to be out there or sending representatives out there to try and find resolutions. None of them are really getting anywhere. Although I suppose we should take some solace in that Liz Truss did not embarrass himself as badly as Macron did. Perhaps he had the illusion that he made progress. I covered this in a previous video, but of course he was immediately contradicted by the Russians. So his diplomatic efforts, or loud diplomacy, were very much geared towards a domestic audience, and it didn't play the game very well. I think it's a safe way of putting it. So what conclusions can we draw a little bit from the meeting between Liz Truss and Sergei Lavrov? Well, not a lot, to be honest. Nothing that was unexpected. But there was a press conference, and he did say some interesting things, perhaps slightly undiplomatic things. And this is not unusual for Russian diplomats. They like to shake things up a little bit. They like to be confrontational. They also like to be divisive. And so here we can see Sergei Lavrov saying that it was like a mute talking to a deaf person. So pretty much no progress. He also used the phrase listening, but not hearing. Now, to the media, these are interesting and insightful comments, but to anyone who actually understands this sort of business, this is actually normal. This is not actually anything unusual, because this form of diplomacy is essentially adversarial negotiation. And in an adversarial negotiation, you don't give away too much to the other side. You hold a lot to yourself because you want them to give away. So in this sort of sense, you're not going to make progress. You are just going to repeat your position to the other side and see if they give anything away when they respond to you. What you're not really doing is changing the script, mixing it up a little bit. Because to do that, you have to improvise. And to improvise at this sort of level, this sort of diplomacy, is A, quite dangerous, but B, exceedingly difficult. Very difficult to get right, very difficult not to find yourself in a position where you can be misinterpreted, if you like, or you can come away misunderstanding what has been agreed. If we were to be charitable, we would say that is what happened to Macron. So really, this proceeded entirely as expected, and the Russians obviously voiced their displeasure. So what really was Liz Truss doing here, shall we say? And there's perhaps three interpretations that I will discuss. One is she was stating the UK position, the Russians stated their position, neither side got anywhere. Highly likely, well, we know this is what happened, and that is the nature of trying to resolve these sort of things. It's almost a war of attrition. You just have to wait the other side out in some ways by repeating your position and seeing when there's movement, when there's the ability to compromise, and then being prepared to exploit that compromise in a way. But that is quiet diplomacy, and that will be done behind closed doors. The second thing to point out is that, like all government ministers, Liz Truss will always go to these meetings with pre-prepared briefing notes prepared by her civil servants. She will have rehearsed what she was going to say, she would have read all the details, and what she did here is she stuck to the script. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. At high-level diplomatic meetings, sticking to the script is very important. However, it is perhaps worth advocating the view that Liz Truss is not really any kind of competent diplomat. Perhaps she is a political figure, after all. How she did her trade deals, as an example of her work on the international circuit, would be widely derided by anyone with any expert knowledge and any decent common sense. So we can't take that as conclusive evidence, but perhaps indicative evidence that Liz Truss is not particularly competent to do this. And this is difficult. This is stuff that taxes the best negotiators, the best diplomats. And I think it's probably not too controversial to say that Liz Truss is possibly not going to be one of them. So in this case, she would have done the right thing. she would have stuck very carefully to the script prepared by her civil servants and not deviated from it, a bit like a robot perhaps. And that probably would have annoyed the Russian foreign minister. He perhaps would have been a little bit more able to have a free-flowing conversation, to try and argue the case, but he was coming up against the script, as it were, a brick wall of not much information. So that's the second thing we can perhaps advocate happened. And the third, of course, is that maybe they did have an actual discussion. Maybe they did put forward each other's proposals, did listen to each other to some degree, and try to advocate for certain movements, certain position changes, if you like. However, there's a game to be played here. This is loud diplomacy. And Russia are very much in this business because they want attention, they want concessions. So we cannot rule out the third option, that no matter what Liz Truss did or said, this is always going to be the outcome, and the Russian foreign minister was always going to say this was unproductive, they weren't listening, they don't care about our concerns, etc., etc. So I think we can make an argument that all three of these possibilities are credible. We won't truly know which one it is. But I thought this was an interesting exercise in understanding how diplomacy works, and also understanding that this sort of diplomacy at this level, which is very heavily political, is not truly a negotiation, or at best a very adversarial negotiation. And when you're in that sort of scenario, you cannot expect sudden movements. Sudden movements tend to cause problems. They tend to cause surprise, and they tend to cause people to make mistakes. And no one wants to make mistakes at this level, and especially with issues as serious as the possibility of a war. So both sides would have been very careful in what they said. They would have been very slow. They would have been very measured. And we should assume that this will continue. So even if the situation does de-escalate, and if either side do make concessions, the whole idea is that this will be done step by step in a carefully managed and measured way. So if, for example, we say option 3 here, and that actually Liz Truss and her Russian counterpart did actually agree a whole host of things to go away and consider, that is exactly what they would have done. They would have listened, made non-committal replies to those proposals, and promised to take them away for further consideration. And that's very much negotiation is similar to diplomacy in that regard when you're dealing with big, complicated things. You listen to what the other side have to say, you take detailed notes. If you're in a collaborative negotiation, you would ask lots of questions to get better detail, and then you would take all that detail away back to the office. Your team will then review it all, think it all through carefully, do a full analysis, and then you would come back with carefully thought replies with accepting, rejecting, or counter-proposing to what they gave you. That is what quiet diplomacy would be. And time will tell if all this effort behind the scenes will lead to a de-escalation of the conflict, or if we will see a continuation of this sort of war of words, this political pushing and shoving, if you like, to try and strengthen their own positions. So I hope you found this little bit of a insight interesting, and I welcome any further views that people may have on this.